Today, Teflon and titanium. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today I'm joined again by Tarric Brooker, journalist. Hello Tarric.
G'day Martin, how are you?
Pretty good. Boy, it's busy at the moment.
Oh, it certainly is. You know, you've got Bridget McKenzie resigning, Barnaby having another crack at the Nationals leadership, and now Richard Di Natale quitting as well. It's been a very, very jam-packed last 24 hours.
And it's only lunchtime on Monday, so goodness me. I guess there was also an interesting poll out today which sort of underscores the fact that ScoMo does appear to be bulletproof.
Yeah, it just seems like there just really isn't that much of an alternative. His personal ratings are plumbing really, really poor lows. His preferred Prime Minister rating, which is normally very, very good for an incumbent, is looking absolutely awful. But still, they're only 4 points behind in the polls.
So do you think that's because people have just lost interest in it and just, forget politics, will get on with the real life? Or what else is going on? Is it the fact that Labor really isn't just seen as a viable alternative?
I think people are just a little bit disengaged at the moment. You know, even on the left, you've got people who experienced this really, really shock election defeat, and now they're just like, oh my God, another 3 years of ScoMo. We thought we had it in the bag. After, so many defeats, we thought finally we had it. But that's not what's happened. It's just worked out completely differently. And now they're just almost numb to it, I think.
And it's interesting because, of course, as crisis after crisis comes on, he seems to be able to not react in a way that perhaps people might think is appropriate. But nevertheless, it doesn't seem to matter.
No, it doesn't. I think it's just got to that point now where people are just so disinterested and so disengaged that, yes, they're angry and yes, they're frustrated, but they're just over politics in general. Like, yes, they don't like Scott Morrison, but they don't really like any of the alternatives either.
Right, so it's a bit of a race to the bottom then, and the last man standing is ScoMo.
Yeah, and I think that it will probably be a pretty effective strategy for Albanese in the long run, because Morrison's going to keep making mistake after mistake after mistake, because there hasn't really been any sort of major shift away from making those sorts of errors. But by the same token, when the time does come for an election, whenever that ends up being, Albo is going to have the most ammo of any politician in Australian history to run attack after attack of remember this, remember the bushfires, remember when all he had to defend Australia from the coronavirus was a pamphlet. That was a great idea, wasn't it?
But I guess the other side of that is that Labor appears to be running the small target strategy at the moment. In other words, they're not going to really be coming out with much policy. And, at the moment, they're basically saying, well, it's his problem, not our problem.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's because, frankly, Labor have problems of their own. While you see everything playing out with the Liberals in the media, Labor haven't really decided exactly what they're going to run on yet, which is why Albo can't really lay out a policy, because he's concerned that someone could come in and just go, I don't agree with this, and start another cycle of Labor infighting. And that's the absolute last thing he wants when the focus is squarely on the Morrison government continuing to make mistakes.
Yeah, so we expect more small target then. But let's sort of stand back slightly then from the political dimension and think about some of the broader perspectives, because clearly the undercurrents here are that the economy, which was already looking a bit dodgy, looks as though it's being dudded thanks to the coronavirus and the lack of movement of Chinese visitors into Australia, both from tourism and from the education perspective, both big earners. And of course, the slowdown potentially in China will have a significant impact for the mining sector and other exports, because we're so trade exposed to China. So it's going to be tricky, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, the budget surplus is likely in tatters at this point. I mean, if Josh Frydenberg manages to somehow rescue this, I will literally write him a very, very nice letter saying, well done, Josh, how'd you do it? But at the end of the day, the government now has the most political cover imaginable if we do go into a recession. No one can reasonably blame them and say it's all on Scott Morrison or this is happening because of them. And the public is just going to look at it and just be like, look, the coronavirus hit us, the bushfires hit us. Yeah, that's sort of, the bushfires could have been managed better. But at the end of the day, realistically, there's not a whole lot Morrison can do to stop that sort of economic event hitting Australia hard.
Yeah, so he's got now plausible deniability insofar that he can say it's not our problem, it's over there. And essentially that means that they can continue to make hay, I suppose, in terms of some of their policies. But I wonder whether they should be thinking of more specific fiscal stimulus ahead of a potential downturn, because I think the chances are there will be, a bad quarter or at least bad half. And I'm not sure they can leave it to the Reserve Bank.
No, they shouldn't. They shouldn't. But whether they actually do is another question. I mean, we haven't seen the abandonment of the surplus that we should have seen in the wake of the bushfires. That should have been enough of a signal for them to go, no, look, we need to protect the economy, we need to protect jobs. Let's forget about the surplus. This is an unprecedented event. And now we've got the coronavirus, which they say is only going to take 0.2% off GDP, which I think is probably drastically understating it, comparing with some of the impact assessments they've done for the US economy. And we really need some sort of fiscal support to make sure that we retain the largest number of jobs when this thing does hit us, so we can get ourselves out of it when it finally abates, whenever that ends up being.
And that's really the point, isn't it? Because we don't know whether this is going to be a short, slight hit, or whether it's going to be a very significant long-term and deep hit. But I'm not sure that just waiting to see what happens is necessarily a very good strategy. I think probably we should be on the front foot a bit on some of these things, unlike where we were with regard to the flights from China.
Yeah, on the flights from China, I will say kudos to Scott Morrison. He made the right choice at the right time for the first time in a crisis since, well, ever really. And he made the right decision, and that has helped to some degree to make people think, okay, maybe this bloke can manage a crisis. But in terms of everything more broadly, there's still an incredibly reactive government that waits to see what happens before acting. And that's the exact opposite of what we need right now. We need, like, as you say, a government that's on the front foot, a government that's going to look at things and go, how can we protect things? How can we be proactive, not reactive? And I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think that's going to happen until we see this worsen somewhat, until it becomes abundantly clear that this isn't just a scare, and this isn't just something that's going to blow over in the next few weeks. But I mean, who knows? We'll see. I was just going to ask, what do you think of this whole virus thing?
So there were three observations. I'm really interested in the way that the media and the social media are talking about it, because it's very hard to separate truth from fiction, from theory, from, I don't think we're getting the full truth, right? It's
No.
my own view. I think it's probably worse in China than people are probably suggesting. But it's almost impossible to know how bad it is, right? Because we don't have there's too much filtering going on. There's too much coordinated communication of don't panic, there's nothing to see here, which I'm concerned about. That's the first point. The second one is the economic impact. My modelling is we're in recession. We are in, even now, because the tourists have gone away, the education system is going to be down significantly because all that new term people won't be able to come back into Australia, and demand from China for iron ore is going to fall. That's going to kill the economy here. So we're stuffed. And my third point then is, if they don't do something quickly, and I think they should, and I'm not sure that a RBA cut's going to make much difference, I think we need direct fiscal stimulus. We need some money out there in the economy. Otherwise, we're going to have a really deep issue for at least 6 months, 9 months, maybe a year.
What do you think of this whole theory of, a lot of analysts are saying, if things are bad Q1, things are going to bounce back? really, really well in Q2.
Well, what's interesting is that if you look at SARS, which is probably the only analogous event, that was relatively short and controlled, and it did bounce back relatively quickly. But I guess one, China is 6 times the size of of what it was in terms of its economic impact globally. Two, there's no guarantee it's going to behave the same way as SARS, because it looks to me as though some of the parameters around this particular virus are different from SARS, and particularly the fact that the ability to share the virus without being detected as effectively being infected is new. So I think that's. And then the third thing is, we've still got the bushfires, we've still got all the issues around there, and if you think about tourism and if you think about education, you sort of miss the boat, right? Because you've gone through the peak of the summer, and so you're going to have less people travelling potentially later in the year. I'm not sure that you can find enough domestic travel to fill the international tourism here in Australia, maybe, but maybe not. So I'm not sure we're going to see this as a quick sort of dip and then bounce back. And by the way, the theory I have is watch European banks, because my theory is that a lot of European banks are really very trade exposed and debt exposed to a lot of what's going on. And those are like Deutsche Bank, right? Those would actually be sufficiently rocky to become effectively an economic risk in their own right. Remember, we've got a lot of GSIBs in Europe, one of the globally significant important banks. That will be enough potentially to, I think, create a GFC Mark II. So I think, don't want to be too doom and gloom, but one end of the spectrum, it might be a quarter or two and then bounce back. But I think there is another theory that says it could be a lot worse than that, a lot longer. And it could be effectively a precursor to a very significant financial crisis. Because, of course, this time around, the banks, central banks, don't have the 4% cuts that they had last time.
No, and I don't think that China has the same ability to just go absolutely manic on the stimulus again and throw all this money at the...
They're already doing it. Now they've put another 140 billion in today. They've already cut the China bank ratios to allow them to effectively lend more and hold less capital. So they've already pulled a lot of those levers, right? Once you pull them, you can't pull them again. So my question is, where is the growth lever going to come from for China? And I don't necessarily see it. So could be a bit of an issue.
Yeah, no, that's what somewhat concerns me looking at the acts of the Chinese central bank, because if they burn all their reserves, all their liquidity now, trying to fight this, trying to prop up the market, they may leave themselves really badly exposed if this does, say, for example, Deutsche Bank goes boom or whatever, there is a financial crisis. They're going to be so vulnerable. It's just, it doesn't almost worth thinking about.
Well, lots of different scenarios, and it's too soon to know for sure. But I think we've got to be aware and alert to the fact that this could actually be quite serious and quite significant. I always said 2020 was going to be an interesting year. It's proving to be the case.
I think that the government need to be very, very careful in the way they manage this crisis, because it's something where people are afraid. They're concerned, and if that turns to fear and that fear turns to panic, then we could have some very, very serious economic issues.
Well, certainly the Reserve Bank has tended to wait and see the data and then make decisions, in the rearview mirror, sort of 3 to 6 months behind perhaps where they should. I'm not sure they're going to change their strategy, so I'm not sure that we're necessarily going to see a rate cut maybe tomorrow, maybe not, but I suspect maybe not. And if in fact the government is going to be also sitting on its hands and saying, well, let's see what happens with the numbers, that means that we're going to have a very significant problem over the next few months until the data really proves the fact that we have an issue.
And the public's confidence in the Morrison government is already quite low. They managed the bushfire crisis poorly, and now there are lives at stake. And unless they can keep making the right decisions, people are going to get increasingly concerned and increasingly start taking matters into their own hands, because that's what we saw with the unions. They said, no, we want these flights ended. And that's also what happened with the Queensland Premier, who came out and said, no, we need these flights to stop. And then finally, once all this pressure had built up on the Morrison government from the unions, from Anna Pasluck, and also from the right-wing media commentators in what I like to call the Credlin Index, because it matters what they think. They are the key indicator. As I've said to you previously, the key indicator is what the right-wing Sky News hosts are saying. Because if they start getting annoyed, if they start seeing Morrison making mistakes that's hurting the Liberal Party, they're the ones who come out and say something, and they're the ones who finally force him into action. If Peter Credlin goes on their show and says Scott Morrison wants to do something, magically within 24 hours, usually something actually happens.
Well, it's an interesting way of making policy decisions, isn't it? It's a bit like Trump and his Fox channel over there.
Yeah, well, the thing is, for Trump, it's worked. And the way that Australian politics has become so polarised now is that we're actually seeing it be relatively effective. While it doesn't appeal to the middle or to the opposite side of the aisle, it's been extremely effective in galvanising support behind Scott Morrison within the Liberal Party. Normally, under these sorts of circumstances, you would start to see leadership rumblings, you would start to see, backbenchers breaking ranks and going to the media themselves and saying, we need to do X. But that's not what's happened. They've managed to galvanise this support behind Scott Morrison in a very Trumpian way, I would say.
Yeah, it does seem to be some interesting parallels. Now, I have one question for you. Is Barnaby just a sideshow, or do you think there's something more behind the scenes going on there?
That's an interesting one, because you never know with Barnaby. He's the most unpredictable character in Australian politics, I would say. But if he sees the opportunity, if he's made the call, I would say that there's something to it. There's some leadership rumblings going on behind the scenes. Maybe he's going to make a deal with some prominent national who's going to be his deputy, who wants to, sort of step up in the world. But Barnaby has a great appeal in the bush for reasons that I don't think most of us really understand. And he's always been the standard bearer, even when he was a senator, even when he was sort of in that sort of background of the coalition. But that's what makes him so dangerous to Michael McCormack's leadership. Michael McCormack has led a very, very normal sort of Nationals leadership role. He's just sort of been there on the periphery. When Scott Morrison goes away, he's acting PM, but he doesn't really do anything. But that's his role. People think, Barnaby's so bombastic. He's always saying something. He's on Sky News, red in the face, screaming at someone about something. And they see that as him being active. But Michael McCormack has played a much more traditional second fiddle to Scott Morrison. And I think, he's played it relatively well.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, well, I should be interested to watch this because I'm with you. I think there's probably a bit more going on. But we should probably just dwell briefly on the sports rort and the issue there because, of course, while Bridget has basically now been moved on, the number one issue, which was effectively that money was being used to support the political intentions of the incumbent, really has not been endorsed at all within the political sphere, has it?
No, it hasn't. I mean, there's this report from the Auditor General that basically just lays out exactly how dodgy this was in terms of breaching guidelines. And obviously, whether or not that's against the law is no matter for the constitutional lawyers and well above our pay grade. But it's not over by any stretch of the imagination. The media has been really, really good on this issue. Specifically, the 10 News political team have been fantastic. They keep following up and they keep hitting all the right buttons and pushing the Morrison government as they should. But people who are speculating that this could cost Morrison his leadership, I think are quite mistaken. I think this likely eventually ends with a senior staffer, maybe a couple, being thrown under the bus, and finally this being put to bed when Morrison and the rest of the coalition leadership realises that this isn't going to just go away with Bridget McKenzie's resignation.
Yeah, but I'm with you again. I think the Teflon is going to be able to protect the man himself.
Yeah, Morrison's a clever dude. He's not a dumb guy. Yeah, he makes silly mistakes and he governs by committee at times when he's unsure of things. But when it comes to like political survival, the man knows how to throw someone under a bus.
buses can be useful sometimes, evidently. So, looking ahead over the next couple of weeks, then, what do you think is the number one thing we should be looking out for?
Oh, that's actually quite a tough question because it just depends on how things develop. If the coronavirus really, I mean, if you had asked me a few weeks ago what was the most important thing, I would have said sports rights. But the coronavirus has just come in out of nowhere, and all of a sudden that's become one of the more important issues. I think the sports rights thing could well and truly flare up again if they get another explosive email or leak from somewhere in the senior coalition leadership, which, let's be honest, wouldn't be all that surprising. But I also think it's going to be interesting to see, in terms of Parliament, to see who ends up succeeding Richard Di Natale as the leader of the Greens, because that could be really important going forward as to sort of how the makeup works in the Senate and how the Morrison government can or can't pass legislation.
Well, I'm interested you touched on the Greens because, of course, the news today was not totally surprising, but nevertheless it does beg the question as to what is the Greens going to be when they grow up?
Yeah. Well, they've sort of been a little bit like Peter Pan in that respect. They've always sort of stuck on these issues that haven't really resonated with the Australian public more meaningfully over time. I mean, one of my favourite points about the Greens is that they peaked in terms of primary vote under Bob Brown over a decade ago now, and that they haven't really gone anywhere. And that's one thing I sort of find a little bit concerning, because the front runners for the leadership, Adam Bandt and Sarah Hanson-Young. You don't have someone more pragmatic and someone more relatable like Scott Ludlam, who was forced to resign after the citizenship to Section 44 constitutional issues. So I'm a little bit concerned that could really give the Liberals a bit of a free kick, in the sense that the Greens are going to be increasingly moving towards this ideology that isn't really compatible with Middle Australia and isn't really going to win them the votes that they think it will.
And that then leaves the door open to more fragmentation, more minor parties, and effectively more confusion in the middle.
Yeah, in all likelihood, if the Greens primary vote drops and they lose their quotas in the Senate at the next election, then yeah, most certainly you could see the rise of the left-wing populist party. That's certainly possible. We've seen it everywhere else. Why not here?
Boy, we live in interesting times, don't we? Well, look, it's very interesting to catch up with you, and we'll do this again sometime soon because there's just so much going on. My view is the virus and the trajectory of that over the next couple of weeks, I think, will be the most determining issue for the first quarter at least, and probably beyond, because everything else actually pales into relative significance, I think, relative to what this could do.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the difference between China having a poor quarter, that's sort of below trend growth, or us going into a serious economic downturn. I mean, this is already going to hit Australia hard. Q1 is probably a write-off at this point, just based on the tourism impact and the impact of lower iron ore prices, etc. But it's whether or not this virus gets more serious, or it spreads, or whatever ends up happening, that's going to really define where we are in terms of politics and economics. Because if the next data coming out for the Q4 GDP is poor, we are going to have a recession in all likelihood, and that's going to hit Scott Morrison like a ton of bricks, whether or not it's either as a result of the coronavirus or not. Because Albanese and the myth of superior economic management is going to really be at risk. And while I think he has a lot of cover that's going to protect him, it's not going to stop Labor and the rest of the Parliament going after him and hammering him about it every day. Because you can't go on about being a superior economic manager for the best part of 25 years and then have a recession and then say, oh, whoops.
Right. Although you can say, well, it wasn't my fault, it was the virus, or it was the bushfires, or it was something else. But at the end of the day, the buck stops, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And at the end of the day, like, what Parliament does and what the people think are two completely different things. While the man in the street is going to say, oh, yeah, all right, well, ScoMo sort of, he did his best. He did all right, But at the end of the day, in Parliament's a very different world. It's a world of broken promises. It's a world of where any little tiny thing, any tiny weakness will be exploited to the best of their ability. Now, whether or not that strategy is effective for Labor, for the Greens, and for whoever else wants to jump on that particular bandwagon is another question. But it doesn't mean that they're not going to try. because they will.
Yeah, interesting times. Well, Tarric, thanks once again for your insights. Really appreciate them, and we'll catch up again soon.
Definitely. Sounds good.
Cheers. So there you have it. Very interesting times we're living in. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.